You're listening to the Access Success Podcast, produced by AccessU, a division of Access Advertising and Public Relations. Hey, let's do something big. I'm your host, Rachel Schneider. Welcome to the Access Success Podcast, where we highlight the important topics focused on education in every form it takes. It seems these days as if we're collectively living in crisis after crisis. I mean, there are social, cultural, and economic issues rising to the surface that have been buried deep for a long time, and the pace at which this information is shared can turn what may be a simple disagreement into a PR disaster. So today, we've decided it's time to revisit how you can prepare and lead through a crisis in your organization. And there are many factors to consider when planning your message and setting the stage to weather a PR crisis successfully, which is why we're bringing on today's guest, Vice President Strategic Communications, Rachel Spencer. Welcome.
Hi, Rachel. Nice to be here, as always.
Great to have you, as always. So, Rachel, tell us, what are some of these factors that people need to keep in mind when structuring their plans, and how have crisis communication strategies needed to evolve alongside technology and social media?
Yeah, so the most important thing really is to have a plan. A lot of organizations, and this is especially true when we're talking about nonprofits or smaller organizations, but, I've run into this with higher education institutions as well, and big companies. They have an organizational crisis plan, and they fail to account for the communications aspect of it. And so having a plan in place is the most important thing to consider when you're thinking about how you can best prepare for the future. But when we're thinking about best practices and how to put that plan together, as you mentioned, so many things have changed, and just the pace of information. So one of the biggest challenges for communicators right now is really balancing the speed of information that has to be delivered in a crisis with accuracy. It can be so easy to try to need to respond really, really quickly to combat false information without fact-checking our own information, and then that just does further damage, right? And so having that plan in place where you have versioned it out for every possible scenario you could think through, and there is really no shortage. It could be a DEIB issue. It could be a Me Too issue. It could be an issue of plagiarism or a tenure disagreement. Cybersecurity is a huge risk right now. Natural disaster, the things that we typically think about when we think about a crisis. Think through all of those different possibilities and how you might respond to them in your plan. It won't be exactly that, but it'll at least give you a starting plan, because the last thing you want to be doing in a crisis is trying to figure out what you're going to do, right? You need to have some sort of a foundation so you can hit the ground running and respond immediately and as quickly as you possibly can.
And so what are maybe the basics of a good PR plan? Like, who are the main stakeholders that we need to keep in mind? And what does that chain of communication need to look like within an organization when a crisis first happens?
Yeah, the most fundamental elements of a good crisis communications plan include not only versioning out your possible scenarios and how you would respond to them, but making sure that you have already identified the people that are going to be involved in responding to that crisis and what their roles are. In a crisis scenario, especially if it's something like a mass shooting or an situation of a natural disaster or something where there is information that's just coming out constantly and very, very rapidly, the last thing that you want to be doing is trying to figure out what everybody needs to be doing and either duplicating efforts or overlooking something that's really, really critical in your response. So identify who the people in your organization are that could be responsible for various elements of your communications plan is vital. Of course, when you're talking about spokespeople, that's probably going to involve either your C-suite or executive suite or, key department leaders. But also making sure that you have different voices at the table to bounce messaging idea. One of the things that we're really seeing differently these days is how much language has shifted, and we can't fall back on the traditional platitudes of, our thoughts and prayers are with people, the same things that we've heard over and over and over again for generations. Language is shifting to be much more authentic, transparent, empathetic, and it also has to reflect the audiences that you're speaking to, and thinking through the fact that you probably have very diverse people that you're needing to get messages out to in different ways. So do you have people at the table who can accurately convey, like, yes, this is going to resonate well, or you're missing the mark, or actually you're going to make it worse if you do that. So having those different voices at the table, and then, making sure that you've got people planning out not only how you're going to respond, but have you thought through the logistics? Have you thought through, do you have a space for a press conference if you need it? Crisis communications is not just about the messaging aspect, but there's a lot of other things that have to go into it. Do you have 24/7 support for social media if you need it? Do you have resources outside your organization that you can bring in to relieve some of the burden that is on your internal staff? Because certainly in a crisis scenario, it can end up being very traumatic for your staff as well, depending on the issue is, and sometimes they're just going to need to step away for a minute and bring in an outside perspective to kind of just help get through the hurdle.
And for those watching and listening, we do have multiple blogs about crisis communication and all of these different topics on our website, AccessU.com. But we really wanted to lay out the basics before we get into the specifics of those as well. And we should also add that when it comes to roles and responsibilities and just the quick changing environment that we live in, roles and responsibilities can change. And a lot of the different factors of your plan can change depending on, let's say you get a new office building or things move around. So those things need to be fluid. Can you talk about how people can make sure that not just they have a plan, but make sure that they are keeping it up to date and sticking to it?
Yeah, that's a great point because, people leave your organization. So maybe the person responsible for putting together the plan has left, or your key spokesperson has left. So we always recommend that you revisit that plan at least quarterly to make sure nothing has shifted or changed externally or internally that would affect how you would respond in a crisis. And then the other best practice too is after you have made it through to the other side of whatever the scenario is, sit down as a team and evaluate what went well, what could have been done better, how do we need to change this for the next time, because it is not a matter of if this is going to happen again, it's when it will happen again. Crises are just cyclical. Now, hopefully, in anybody's tenure, they would only have, one or two really major crises, but they will happen again and they will evolve and they'll be slightly different the next time. So how are you going to adjust to make it better? One of the things too that, we always recommend is when you're kind of evaluating the plan at the end of a crisis, look back and measure it against what your long-term communication objectives are strategically, because sometimes a crisis, it could impact everything that you do as an organization moving forward, especially, for example, if it's like a situation where you've found out that there are fundamental issues in how you have approached the issue of diversity and inclusion within your organization, and you've got to change everything about that moving forward. You're going to have to be prepared to put action behind your words as a strategic objective, and so your communications plan may have completely changed from what your messaging would have been to how it needs to be sensitive to what you've just gone through as an organization. Otherwise, you're going to be tone deaf and you will have learned nothing, and that crisis is going to come back a lot quicker.
Yeah, I know we've talked about that in the past, speaking to DEIB consultants in the area, just about how, these days it seems like a lot of large companies, take Pride Month, for example, they tend to be performative, but you don't see a ton of action behind those. Yeah. So especially if they go through a crisis, making sure that they are making it a point to have those policies in their organization and make an actual difference is so huge. And then in addition to working with different clients and just your experience, what have you seen to be one of the most overlooked steps in a crisis communications plan, or what's something that people are maybe surprised to hear about when we take them on as clients and we say, hey, actually, you really do need to do this?
Well, the one thing is what you just mentioned, the need for making actionable steps and not just being performative in your messaging. I think that's really critical, and there's a big shift happening. It used to be, crisis communication 101 20, 30 years ago, very much a spin doctor game, right? So you could sweep things under a rug maybe, and just over time, people see right through that. And so you cannot put together just a quick statement and expect that your situation is going to go away because you said the right things. People will follow up. And so having, actions in place with your crisis communication plan is like, how are we going to learn from this, evolve from it, adjust our strategy? What, do we have the right people at the table in order to make actionable recommendations? That's probably one of the biggest things that's overlooked in terms of a crisis response. But the other thing too is just the simple act of practicing ahead of time, and that includes media training. A lot of times, people will come to us with a crisis communications need, and they've had no media training prior to dealing with the crisis. And so we always build that in the last minute. And what happens is that it's a very stressful time because we're trying to put a lot on them all at once. So we always recommend sort of the importance of regular media training, not only for your spokespeople, but for anybody who would be supporting them or have an opportunity to speak to the media or to the public on behalf of the crisis. Because again, it's all about, what do you not want to have to be focusing on in the moment? You want to be well prepared. And so that media training and that practice makes perfect is really important.
Yeah. Coming from the other side, spending my past life as a journalist, that was something that I definitely saw. Is I could tell which organizations had a plan and had statements already drafted and which ones didn't. And it made a huge difference just in the coverage of the event that was happening. So that's so critical and important, and just practicing in front of the camera and making sure somebody's comfortable with that, not just with statements, but, let's say in the rare event you get cornered for an interview. I mean, it happens more likely with politicians all the time. Mm-hmm. But people who are the head spokespeople of an organization, it's kind of free game for media. I mean, we just expect them to be able to have the answers or know the answers. And when it comes to following up in a crisis situation, if one reporter has been following that story all the way through, they are going to come back with those very strategic follow-up questions to try and get you to trip up and spill a little bit more tea about what's going on. So I see that as such a huge asset. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention off that?
I think that it's a good conversation to have, and why your key messages are so important too, because, we find a lot that if you're unprepared with what it is, like the core message that you want to be communicating, to your point, people are always going to kind of come back and try to get a little bit more information out of you. You might not have it at the time, or it might not be something that you can legally share for whatever reason, but you've got to be able to go back to your key messages, and you've got to be prepared for if you walk out your door one day and a camera is right there and they're shoving a microphone in your face. Like you said, that's not likely to happen unless you're a politician, but it does happen, and we've seen that happen with our clients before. And without being adequately prepared, all the hard work that they might have done to prepare just goes out the window.
Yeah, and I should also add that it's not just making sure that your main spokespeople have that key messaging. It kind of needs to be everybody in your organization, because there's so many crises that I've witnessed different businesses or organizations go through, and it's not usually their lead spokesperson that leaks something. It'll be an employee that messages the news, or it'll be something else that comes into play. You have to be sure that those other stakeholders in your organization, outside your organization, know what's going on.
Oh, for sure. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because you know what? That is the other thing that really does get overlooked a lot. We get so focused on what the external messaging is going to be in the crisis that we haven't thought about the internal messaging. Your staff knows something's up, right? Or your volunteers or your students, if it's big enough, especially, they know what's going on. And if you haven't adequately communicated to them, one, they're going to feel misled, and you're going to erode trust. But two, anybody who has a position to if they have a phone, they could get a call, and do they know what to say or who to direct those questions to so that accurate information is given? And yeah, that's a great point, because if you haven't thought through that, then it takes one call to one person who has has something to say without, wants to try to be helpful. That's a lot of times what we see. They just want to be helpful, but they don't have the right information, and it just snowballs after that.
For sure. Or just making sure that, you have different confidentiality in place for certain people in the organization. Because I'll tell you, as a past member of the media, I got a lot of story ideas or tips just from, people forget journalists are members of your community too. And we go out, we have fun with our friends, and we go to local restaurants and stuff. And the things that I've overheard people talking about have oftentimes turned into stories. Or, you meet somebody briefly. Oh, hey, what do you do? Oh, things are stressed at work. Oh, what's going on? And then it just, people have no idea what a little bit of a tip can lead somebody in the media to. And these days too, everybody's the media. Something that goes on social media can easily become a tip for a national outlet if the story is right.
Right. You've got one person who posts one thing in the right forum, and it will just explode from there.
Is there anything else you wanted to add as far as crisis comm and media training? I see a lot of people who are actually filling PR roles for the first time, coming over from journalism or going to a different role. Maybe they're taking on, a PR role for the first time at their organization. I know a lot of this can sound daunting, but are there any tips or messages that you have for people?
No, I think that it really just comes down to just don't get caught unawares and unprepared. That plan really does make all the difference in the world. And if you have even just something simple in place and know who the people are that are going to be involved, you're so much better able to quickly respond. And it's true, depending on what organizations are, you may never think that crisis communications is going to be part of your job, but increasingly you have to bring so many different people to the table with it. So it really is, it's something not to overlook for sure.
Well, thanks so much, Rachel. And for anybody watching and listening, like I said earlier in the show, you can read up more on crisis communication and your plan, structuring your plan, everything from the basics to media training, handling that in a crisis, the logistics. We've got content for that. You can find it all on AccessU.com. We publish new blogs and podcasts every single week. So see you next time. Thanks for listening to the Access Success Podcast, produced by AccessU, a division of Access Advertising and Public Relations. Find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram to keep up with what the world of education needs to hear, at AccessU Agency, and connect with us at accessu.com. Let's do something big.